Welcome to The Explainer. I am absolutely thrilled to have you here today because we are looking at something truly special. We spend so much time talking about history in these broad, sweeping strokes, the Roaring Twenties, the Great Depression, the post-war boom. But today we're getting ground level. We're setting the stage for a raw, totally unvarnished look at a true 20th century oral history. We're going to dive into the transcribed memories of Ralph and Helen Belotti and really piece together the gritty reality of their lives from the ground up.
It brings up a powerful question that we really need to sit with right off the bat. What is the real, unvarnished price of the American dream? In this explainer, we are completely bypassing the polished myths. Forget the cinematic tropes. We're going straight into the reality of survival. We're going to see exactly what it costs an immigrant family to carve out a living, both physically and psychologically, during some of the absolute hardest decades in modern history.
Okay, let's dive right into this. Section 1, Crossing Two Worlds. So Ralph and Helen's early childhoods were entirely defined by this profound sense of dislocation. They were constantly bouncing between two entirely different cultures. Ralph was actually born in Kenosha, Wisconsin, back in 1914. But then by 1920, his family completely packs up and moves back to a rural cliffside town in Italy. And then fast forward to 1929, literally right before the stock market crashes, a teenage Ralph is sent back to America completely alone. Just imagine the absolute whiplash of that back and forth migration before you're even old enough to drive. You can imagine the culture shock, right? It was jarring. In Italy, life was undeniably hard. They were working from before dawn to dusk, growing their own wheat, making their own wine. But it was this idyllic, tight-knit community. Ralph felt secure there. But then contrast that with his return to Wisconsin. He's living as a farmhand for a host family, eating meals in total agonizing silence. He felt this deep, bitter isolation. He noted that people just looked at him like he was a, quote, dago immigrant. He summed up that deep alienation perfectly. He said, "I was a package," talking about arriving in Chicago with a literal physical label pinned to his chest. He didn't speak the language, he had zero agency. And Helen? She faced a very similar parallel of forced assimilation. When she got to America, she was bullied so relentlessly that her father actually had to legally change her beautiful Italian name, Raffaella, to Helen, just to make the schoolyard torment finally stop.
Section 2. The labor of survival.
Once they were in America, the Great Depression really sank its teeth in, and they were forced into a level of grueling physical labor that is honestly kind of hard to fathom today. Think about this shocking number, $1. That was Ralph's daily wage working on a farm in Wisconsin. One single dollar a day to pay for his room and board. In the oral history, he talks about sitting at the dinner table with his host family, practically starving after working out in the fields all day, but being entirely too ashamed and timid to ask for even a second piece of bread. And the sheer weight of Ralph's endless string of jobs really drives home the relentless physical toll of his survival. At 14 years old, he's sifting wheat. Later on, he's swinging an axe, building dams in a civilian conservation corps camp. He's building roads for the WPA. He's working in a dusty asbestos factory and then spends decades on the final repair line at Nash Motors. His entire existence was basically defined by backbreaking manual labor. Okay, there's this one visceral anecdote that completely blew my mind. Ralph and a friend drove out to Leona, Wisconsin, desperately looking for work in a lumber camp. They didn't have a dime for a room, so they slept in their car in 10 degrees below zero weather. Seriously. To avoid freezing to death in their sleep, they would bundle up, get out of the car in the pitch black, run a mile down the road, and run a mile back just to get their blood pumping again before huddling back inside the car. They did that for 3 straight nights. Meanwhile, Helen was enduring her own parallel nightmare. Her mother suffered from severe physical and mental illness, which meant a 12-year-old Helen was essentially left to raise her younger siblings. She managed all the cooking, the intense cleaning, the entire emotional burden of the household. And she often faced physical abuse if her mother's impossible standards weren't met. I mean, they were just kids, but their childhoods were completely erased by duty. Which brings us to Section 3, the invisible scars. You simply cannot put a human being through that much physical and emotional stress without leaving profound, invisible scars. Let's pause and really think about this for a second. What actually happens when the mind breaks under the sheer pressure of survival? We've talked a lot about their physical hardships, but the deep psychological wounds they carried, those were arguably so much heavier. Right before Ralph and Helen were supposed to get married, Ralph just collapsed. He spiked a 105-degree fever that stubbornly lasted for weeks. He was thrown into an isolation hospital. The doctors ran spinal taps, they ran every test imaginable. But there was no virus, none. It was simply the intense physical manifestation of a total mental collapse. His nervous system basically shattered under the pressure of his own life. Ralph's own words about this time are just raw and heartbreaking. After this nervous breakdown, he suffered from crippling panic attacks. His stomach completely rejected normal meals, to the point where for an entire year, a grown adult man survived solely on baby food. The trauma literally stripped away his ability to function in the world for a while. And Helen's trauma was equally severe. She lived her early life in a constant, suffocating state of fear, trying to manage her mother's severe mental health crises and epileptic fits. In one horrifying incident she talks about, she found her mother after she had swallowed an entire bottle of iodine. Helen says that during the months her mother was locked away in a psychiatric ward, she and her sister were, quote, like orphans, left to fend entirely for themselves. It was systematically breaking their bodies down. I mean, Ralph took an axe to the face in the CC camp. It fractured his eye bones, which he always believed triggered his lifelong neurological issues. At John's Manville, he breathed raw asbestos dust all day because his safety mask kept steaming up. Helen suffered from kidney stones so incredibly severe right after giving birth that her weight plummeted to just 90 pounds. It's literally just one brutal physical hit after another. Moving to Section 4. Forging a family legacy. So, how do you even build a loving family when you're carrying the weight of all those overlapping crucibles? Well, their past traumas directly dictated their daily survival tactics and their hypervigilant parenting. When their daughter Vicky was an infant with a sensitive throat, Helen was so utterly terrified of her starving or choking that she fed her meticulously through an enlarged hole in a bottle nipple, drop by drop for hours on end. Ralph was so deeply afraid of the world that he wouldn't even let his son Vince go fishing, out of constant fear he'd drown. And they survived by stretching $19 a week, literally fighting landlords just to get the heat turned on in the dead of winter. But look at Ralph's really poignant self-analysis later in his life. He says, "Success. I didn't get out of line. Now that I analyze my life, it was hard." He finally realizes that his strictness, his constant worry, his sheer inability to just be happy-go-lucky were driven entirely by his shattered nervous system and that brutal environment that raised him. He simply did what he had to do to keep his family alive. You know, we always contrast that idealized, carefree version of the American dream, spreading your wings, boundless opportunity, a happy-go-lucky attitude, with the unvarnished reality. For the Belottis, and honestly millions of others just like them, the reality was nose to the grindstone and a state of perpetual anxiety. It was never really about thriving, it was strictly about surviving. Which leaves us with this final provocative thought. As we look around at the comforts of the modern world we live in, we have to ask ourselves, what is the true gritty cost of the lives we inherit? The Belotti history shows us that the foundation of the lives we live today was so often built on the immense silent sacrifices and the profound resilience of the generations before us. I highly encourage you to look into your own family histories. You might be completely surprised by the sheer willpower you find there. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and I'll catch you next time.